My grandmother, aunt, and uncle reunited with my grandfather in Seoul, and then made their way to a makeshift refugee camp outside the city. They weren't alone. In the years before and during the war, 10% of the entire population of North Korea, roughly 1 million people, escaped to the south. They formed their own refugee communities outside of mainstream South Korean society, which regarded them with general suspicion. But any plan for assimilation into the newly formed nation would be disrupted on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces led by Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un, began an artillery attack on the south and a military push that captured Seoul. 2 weeks before my mother was born, General MacArthur, who was in charge of the American troops, launched an amphibious attack at Incheon and pushed quickly up to Seoul. My mother was born amid artillery fire, but when she was 3 days old, Seoul had been liberated from North Korean forces. Nobody on my mother's side of the family has anything to say about the war. They are either dead somewhere in North Korea or in the United States. My grandmother never spoke of what happened during those years, and my mother was too young to remember. They knew that 2 million people died. My uncle died of typhus during the war, but nobody talked about that either. All they said was that when he died, my grandfather wrapped his body in a blanket and disappeared for 3 days. He apparently told my grandmother where he buried the body only when he was in his 60s, hobbled from diabetes and near death himself. The men in their refugee village went into the forests, chopped down wood, and burned it to make charcoal to sell. My mother says she can recall the image of a man covered in soot, standing in the entryway to their shack, but she isn't sure if this is a real memory or her mind's struggle to make visual sense out of whatever her own mother had let slip about those years. This is not uncommon, of course, but I mention it only because if I wanted to tell my daughter that all this death, her great-uncle and all the hundreds of friends and relatives left behind in the North, was her inheritance, I would have to look at a history book. After the war, my mother's family moved to Seoul, where my grandfather found work as a scavenger. Every morning he would go to the U.S. Army base in Itaewon, find discarded surplus, load it up on a cart, and sell it on the streets. This quickly turned into a storefront, which, in turn, briefly became a profitable business. I never really knew him, but looking at photos, I can see he had dark skin, which explains, I suppose, how my sister and I turned out to be several shades darker than our parents. On July 27, 1953, the war ended with an armistice agreement that established the demilitarized zone on the 38th parallel. It would take decades for my grandparents to realize that they would never see their friends and family again. At my grandmother's funeral in 2019, my father, who had known her since he began dating my mother at the age of 19, noted that while my grandmother complained all day long about everything, from the indifference of her grandchildren to the quality of produce in Los Angeles, she seemed to have completely blocked out the 3 decades she spent in South Korea. The years between fleeing the North and moving to Los Angeles had effectively been erased. My mother and the 4 siblings who were born during and directly after the war have no idea how their own mother felt about the family's uprooting and brief fortune. But they all deal with adversity in a similarly pragmatic way. Problems are just things to be solved. Trauma was an abstract concept that reflected a weakness of will.